Welcome to the Nova Scotia College of Nursing's webinar on Transition to Practice, intended for nurse managers, clinical nurse educators, and professional practice leads. My name is Jeline Simmons, and I, along with Savia Pai, will be your hosts for this webinar. We are both practice consultants here at NSCN in the Standards, Guidance, and Customer Experience service area. The purpose of this webinar is to provide managers, educators, and practice leaders with information they should consider when developing transition to practice plans for newly licensed international nurses. If you are listening to obtain information about the application process, please go to our website and click on the orange Expedited Licensure Process box on our homepage and review the Frequently Asked Questions document. In this webinar, we will be discussing licensure for the newly licensed nurse, transition to practice and orientation, accountabilities in supporting newly licensed nurses. We have 3 case studies and other regulatory-related information.
The mandate of the College is outlined in legislation, the Nursing Act. The mandate of the College is to serve and protect the public interest, preserve the integrity of the nursing profession, and maintain public and registrants' confidence in the ability of the nursing profession to regulate itself. As the regulatory body, NSCN is a safeguard that ensures the public that all nurses in Nova Scotia have the competence they need to practice safely, competently, ethically, and compassionately. NSCN regulates nursing practice through registration, licensure, professional conduct, and education program approval processes, approval and promotion of codes of ethics, and the establishment and promotion of the standards of practice for nursing, entry-level competencies, and a continuing competence program. As the Standards and Guidance and Customer Experience team, we guide nursing practice through the development of resources such as guidelines, position statements, Q&As, toolkits, and online learning modules, provide practice consultations through a variety of ways such as phone, email, video, and on-site, and provide education consultations through a regulatory lens. We work with our internal teams at NSCN, such as the registration team or the professional conduct team, to fully meet the needs of the public, our registrants, employers, and other stakeholders. The College does not create best practice guidelines on specific nursing interventions. This would be more the role of an association. We do not create organizational policy. However, organizations may collaborate with us to provide guidance through a regulatory lens. We do not breach confidentiality. All of our practice consultations are confidential. However, in situations where the safety of the public, the client, or the nurse is at stake, we do have to breach confidentiality. We do not resolve employment disputes such as vacation time, overtime, or fees. This would be more the role of the union.
Since the onset of the pandemic, we have been evolving and changing our policies to ensure that we are positively contributing to the number of nurses available to practice in Nova Scotia. In the early days of the pandemic, we developed rapid reinstatement to enable retired nurses to quickly return to practice to support the pandemic response. By early 2022, we had licensed over 500 nurses. In 2021, we redeveloped our special event conditional licensure process so we could rapidly license nurses already licensed elsewhere in Canada so they could quickly come to Nova Scotia. A process that had begun with 9 Canadian Red Cross nurses and 12 travel nurses evolved into a licensure pathway that has licensed over 300 nurses in just over a year and a half. Also in 2021, we developed a program that enabled nurses meeting some, but not all of the practice hour requirements to return to practice with a series of conditions intended to ensure the nurse had the appropriate supervised mentorship with the employment setting. Over 80 nurses re-entered practice in this manner. In early January 2023, Premier Houston held a healthcare leaders summit. He instructed all healthcare leaders to go like hell to develop solutions to address the current healthcare crisis. This summit led to two major policy changes at NSCN, resulting in the expedited registration and licensing process for two distinct groups of applicants. The first are nurses coming to Nova Scotia who are already registered and licensed in good standing in another Canadian jurisdiction. Second are international nurses, registered and licensed in good standing in 7 specific countries. The first NSCN policy change is in relation to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement related to nurses. The Patient Access to Care Act, or PACA, requires that all regulators license individuals coming to Nova Scotia within 5 days of a complete application. Qualifying nurses are most often licensed within 24 hours. Nurses with a discipline history or a criminal record will require further assessment. In addition to mandated registration timelines, PACA also prohibits NSCN from charging fees for the initial license. Since we implemented this change on May 29, 2023, 641 nurses have been licensed. For context, we licensed 522 Canadian Free Trade Agreement nurses in all of 2022. It's international nurses already licensed in Canada who can apply to Nova Scotia under this process. The second NSCN change was implemented on May 1, 2023. Registered nurses who demonstrate good standing and good character and are licensed in the Philippines, India, Nigeria, the USA, the UK, Australia, or New Zealand are eligible for registration and licensure in Nova Scotia immediately with no additional requirements other than passing the nursing entrance exam. They are no longer required to apply to the National Nursing Assessment Service, or NNAS. They can apply directly to NSCN. These international nurses may choose to go down the RN or the LPN pathway to licensure. If they choose the RN path, they have to write the RN National Exam, the NCLEX RN, and if they choose the LPN path, they will need to write the LPN National Licensing Exam, the CPNRE. The fine details of this policy change are: it reduces the time from application to licensure from 1.5 to 2 years down to a matter of a few months. It reduces the cost from $5,000 US to approximately 150 Canadian dollars. Nurses can enter practice while waiting to take the exam, much like new graduates from Nova Scotia nursing programs. It adds nurses to the health system a year sooner than the previous process. Since May 1st, there has been nearly 14,000 applications. Of those, it's been broken down to approximately 710 who live in Nova Scotia currently, 850 who are in Canada but outside of Nova Scotia, and the remainder of applicants remain abroad. The latest numbers indicate that 72 international nurses have been licensed under this process in just 1.5 months. In our previous processes, we were assessing each international nurse's unique education. We have determined that obtaining registration and licensure from one of the 7 countries means that the education completed is equivalent to the entry to practice requirements here in Nova Scotia. Registration in their home country means they have been educationally prepared to practice as a nurse in Nova Scotia, but passing the exam means that they have the necessary competence for practice. Completing entry-level education and established registration and licensure in one of those 7 countries deems them to have met the English language requirement. If the applicant has not passed the applicable registration exam, they will become eligible for conditional licensure.
In the next few slides, we will be speaking about the types of license nurses will be granted under our expedited licensure processes. Nurses coming to Nova Scotia under the expedited CAPTA process have already passed the required licensing exam and as such are all granted practicing licenses. International nurses coming to Nova Scotia under the expedited international licensure process who have already passed the required registration exam elsewhere, usually the US, may be granted practicing licenses. International nurses who are not granted a practicing license will receive a conditional license for one of 2 reasons. They have met all the registration requirements and still must pass the required registration exam, or they have met all the registration requirements, which may or may not include passing the required registration exam, but have been away from practice for a period of 5 years or more. Nurses with conditional license will have conditions and restrictions on their license. It is important to understand that the conditions on the license are public safeguards intended to ensure that nurses are supported to provide safe and competent nursing services as they make the transition into the healthcare system. Conditional licenses have been used for many years by NSCN and the legacy colleges. These conditions apply to both domestically or internationally educated nurses who are newly licensed with NSCN until they pass the required registration exam. As of May 1, 2023, the policy related to conditional licensure is the same for all nurses. The conditional license is issued for 4 months and can be renewed twice for a maximum of 12 months or 3 exam failures, whichever comes first. Nurses can continue to write their respective registration exam after 3 failures or conditional licenses and will qualify for a practicing license upon passing the exam. When an applicant fails the exam, they must reapply for another conditional license before they return to work. There are 2 types of conditional licenses. The newly licensed nurse conditions apply to both domestically or internationally educated nurses who are newly licensed with NSCN until they pass the required registration exam. The mentorship and transition to practice conditions apply to those nurses who are returning to practice after a period of 5 or more years away from practice and remain in place until all the conditions have been met, one of which may be to pass the registration exam. It is critical to understand that a nurse with a conditional license is either new to nursing practice, such as a newly graduated nurse, or new to nursing practice in Canada, such as an international nurse. The conditions and restrictions are intended to support the nurse to provide safe practice. The nurse is not limited from practicing to the optimal scope of practice of their nursing designation. While there are no limitations on their practice, their noviceness is an important context to be considered as they enter the workplace. While waiting to pass the exam, the new nurse must engage in a comprehensive orientation or transition to practice plan to the practice setting, have access to a nurse mentor who can provide practice and clinical mentorship, assistance, and consultation. However, if they have failed the applicable license exam, they must have access to an on-site designated nurse for mentorship, assistance, and consultation. Not be the only regulated care provider on a unit, or the nurse in charge, unless with a mentor. In the event of exam failures, the nurse should notify their employer of the change in the conditions that now requires them to have an access to a designated on-site nurse mentor for a period of time as determined by the employer. Notify NSCN of their licensure exam results if taken through another regulatory body, and maintain written records articulating compliance with the conditions and restrictions to provide to NSCN upon request.
Transition to practice programs for nurses must continue to evolve to match the changing healthcare environments. Whatever the practice context, nurses must be well prepared to function safely and competently in new practice settings, as well as when they accept new roles and new responsibilities. Nurses new to Nova Scotia have unique needs that may require additional support as they transition to practice in Nova Scotia. Supportive practice environments are integral for new nurses to feel welcome, safe, valued, respected, and nurtured to provide safe, competent, ethical, and compassionate care to Nova Scotians. A well-designed and evidence-informed orientation or transition to practice program is critical for the successful transition of any nurse in any area of practice. It is particularly important for the successful integration of newly licensed nurses. A comprehensive orientation or transition to practice plan for nurses includes additional support for nurses that are beyond the general organizational orientation. They may include education sessions as well as preceptor-led shifts. Orientation length will vary and is determined through an analysis of the nurse's experience in the context of the competencies required to practice safely and competently in the employment setting. We suggest you consider the following components as you develop a comprehensive orientation or transition to practice plan. Using the nurse's self-assessment of learning needs to develop a competency-based plan that is centered on the needs of the nurse in a context of the practice environment. Education specific to the client population served in that particular practice setting. Formal and informal learning opportunities using adult learning principles and providing structured and unstructured learning activities such as classroom training, mock scenarios, clinical practice, preceptorship, as well as peer support. Review of the job description, role expectations, policy processes, and guidelines for the unit. As well, consider review of the Nova Scotia College of Nursing Standards of Practice and Codes of Ethics for their particular designation. Orientation to specific healthcare team roles and supports, and also supports that may be available from system partners such as Nova Scotia Health, the IWK, the Department of Health and Wellness, the Health Association of Nova Scotia, and Continuing Care. Another important part of the transition to practice into the Nova Scotia healthcare system for nurses is to assist them in the development of a professional growth plan. The intent of this process is to reflect on their current practice as well as their self-assessment and determine what aspects they may need to further develop, including putting learned concepts into practice. The development of a professional growth plan will help strengthen the nursing practice, and it helps nurses to identify specific areas of learning to focus on as they transition, and it helps them set, meet, and reflect on their professional development goals. In addition to the development of a professional growth plan being helpful in their transition to practice, all nurses in Nova Scotia are expected to do this annually as a component of our continuing competence program. Other ways you can support the nurse with their professional growth plan would be recognizing that this may be the first time the nurse is developing a professional growth plan. You can encourage the nurse to review their standards of practice and code of ethics. You can assist the nurse in identifying specific areas of learning where they may have gaps or they have not had the practice experience to support development of their learning goals. You could refer them to an SCN's website for further information on our continuing competence program, and also refer them to practice at nscn.ca to speak with a practice consultant.
Minimizing risk in nursing practice most importantly enhances client safety, but also improves the nurse's ability to meet their standards of practice. All nurses are expected to use their professional knowledge and judgment to identify and minimize risk when engaging in nursing practice. As previously discussed in the section on developing a professional growth plan, as a newly licensed nurse in Nova Scotia, it is important that nurses identify what their learning gaps may be and how and where to access available resources to minimize risk. It is important that leadership be able to support them to identify what their learning gaps may be and how and where to access available resources within the practice area to minimize risk. By articulating clear expectations for their area of practice, as this may assist the nurse in further identifying any learning gaps and potential high-risk practices, and ensuring that a practice identified as high risk does not mean that they do not take part in the practice, but rather that the new nurse is aware of and identifies ways to minimize that risk. One example of a strategy to assist leaders to recognize and minimize risk in practice is considering and applying the three-factor framework when determining scope of employment and assignment. The three factors to consider are the client, the nurse, and the environment. Please refer to our website to find more information on the three-factor framework in our Nursing Scope of Practice guidelines. Your accountabilities in supporting the transitioning nurse include recognize the unique needs of nurses new to Nova Scotia and the health system, ensure that nurses are supported to work within their role, scope of practice, individual competence, and conditions of their license, provide essential support systems, including preceptors, mentors, and material resources to support their transition, create an environment that encourages nurses to ask questions and engage in reflective practice, promote a culture that creates trust and mutual respect to flourish among team members, and address professional practice issues or employment issues that have been brought to your attention. Our cultural humility and safety practice support tool may be helpful to support the transitioning nurse and is available on our website. Consider engaging in the following actions as you support the transition of the new nurse into your staffing mix. Clearly identify and communicate the expectations of the role and responsibilities for the new nurse. Arrange for education and clinical experiences for the nurse to build their competencies, confidence, and apply their knowledge and skills, including leadership and collaboration. Provide opportunities for the nurse to work through processes or scenarios. Consider the competencies and transition period of the nurse and other staff to ensure appropriate staffing and when determining client assignments. And recognize even if the nurse has met the English language proficiency requirements, adjusting to new diverse accents or dialects and conversational language may be stressful and support may be required. Our team has developed a series of transition to practice resources to support nurses new to practice, whether domestically or internationally educated, and provide guidance for employers, preceptors, mentors, and managers who are working with nurses who are transitioning to practice in Nova Scotia.
We have developed a few case studies based on questions that we have seen and heard. Case Study 1. Joe has been working as a CCA for the last 18 months and has recently obtained an RN conditional license. Currently, there are no vacant RN positions. Can Joe work as a CCA even though they have an RN conditional license? What things should be considered? Although dual licensure is permitted by law, NSCN does not support it and does not recommend that nurses practice concurrently as a nurse and an unregulated care provider. In a nurse's work environment, dual licensure can create role confusion as well as accountability and liability issues for nurses and their employers, and can also potentially impact the quality of care provided to clients and their families. If a nurse decides to work in a dual capacity, we advise them not to practice on one unit as both a nurse and an unregulated care provider. It is also important to note that hours worked as an unregulated care provider cannot be counted towards nursing practice hours. We also recommend that employers not permit nurses to practice concurrently as both a nurse and an unregulated care provider on the same unit or the same shift. NSCN encourages employers to optimize the scope of practice of nurses by employing them in nursing positions that match their highest level of accountability.
Case Study 2. Sam recently obtained an LPN conditional license and is booked for a night shift. There have been a series of sick calls, and Sam will be the only licensed provider in the facility. What should be considered? Sam will need to follow the conditions that are associated with their conditional license until they have successfully passed their exam, one of which being not be the only regulated care provider on a unit or the nurse in charge, unless with a mentor. The other licensed care providers do not need to be of the same designation as the conditional license holder. The assignment must be altered to meet Sam's conditions. Newly licensed nurses have not had the opportunity to integrate their education and clinical experience in a new practice environment. While they are educationally prepared to evolve as a practitioner to manage multiple priorities and emergencies, it is unlikely they can do this effectively alone so early in their practice. Newly licensed nurses, whether domestically or internationally educated, require the support of other licensed care providers as they transition in their new role in your organization.
Case study number 3. I have a nurse on my unit with a conditional license who has failed their licensing exam. As their manager, what do I need to know? The nurse must stop working immediately. If the nurse has failed their licensing exam for the first or second time, they must have access to an on-site designated nurse for mentorship, assistance, and consultation. They can apply for another conditional license and return to practice when it's been approved. The nurse will continue to have an opportunity to license for up to 3 writes of the exam or 12 months in duration, whichever comes first. The intention of the designated nurse is to be accessible to provide in-person support to the conditional license holder, if and when it's needed. On-site means the nurse mentor is in close proximity to the conditional licensure holder. This condition is a public safeguard to ensure that a nurse with the necessary competence and professional capacity has been designated specifically to provide the conditional license holder with assistance and consultation if and when required. Additionally, it is meant to ensure that the conditional license holder is never in a situation where they cannot reach out to another nurse for assistance. The nurse may require additional support with their professional growth plan to highlight areas where practice gaps have been identified. For final clarity, the conditional license holder remains responsible and accountable for their own nursing practice at all times. This includes knowing when and how to access mentorship and guidance. The designated nurse is not required to co-sign medications, treatments, or documentation of the conditional license holder unless it is otherwise required by policy. For example, double signatures on drug counts.
Thank you for participating in this webinar. If you have any questions related to this webinar or any practice questions, please contact an NSCN practice consultant at practice@nscn.ca. Thank you.